that cheap, inexpensive patent pending may actually be the most expensive thing you ever end up paying for. So let's go over this process. This process applies to utility patent applications. Now, a provisional can fit within this process, and I mentioned a provisional patent application specifically because that's what every one of these websites that I've checked out is actually trying to sell you. A provisional patent application is just a document that gives notice to the patent office that you intend to file for a utility patent application within a year. So the steps for getting a patent, not merely a patent application, but getting a patent, are first to educate yourself through enrolling. I didn't write that up here. Second is to evaluate, and that means doing a patent search. The third step is to equip. That's actually filing the patent application. The fourth step is to go through an examination phase. Now there's a fifth stage, and that's enforcement. That's after the allowance. However, because this is just going to cover how much it costs to get the patent to issue, we're going to ignore that for right now. But within this process, the numbers that you'll see quoted on these websites are for that very beginning part, and it's just an optional part of the filing phase. And that's for a provisional patent application. So when you see a quote for a flat rate, that's what they're offering you. By the way, I have another video where I go over how much a provisional patent application can cost or should cost, and what you're actually paying to get when you pay to get a provisional patent application. Because a provisional patent application is not a thing. It can actually be a number of different things, and you need to be aware of what those are. So we mentioned this process, and it kind of looks like a timeline. And for comparison purposes, I'm going to take this timeline and put it over here, and you'll notice that we start at the very bottom for the searches, and then we go through the steps. And I'm calling it their path because that's what they imply is happening, that it's some straight linear path. And you would think with some straight linear path you could predict the cost. And maybe that's where the illusion happens, because just like I mentioned earlier, you don't know how tall a tree will grow before you plant the seed. That's more like what getting a patent's really like. Think of it as a kind of this living organic thing, because the environment it's in is changing. There are competitors popping up all the time. Just like the weather changes, so do patent laws and patent rules. And all of these things could come into affect how much it's going to cost to get a patent and what that patent will actually end up covering. So if you think about it from this point of view, then evaluating, which is doing the search, is kind of like checking the soil. You figure out where you can plant your seed. So you'd never plant an oak tree in sandy soil. So you're just looking for the right soil, if you will, to plant your invention. And sometimes you'll discover that, well, your idea is already out there, and you shouldn't even go ahead and file for the patent itself. In fact, that can be a great outcome because it saves you lots of money, and it also saves you years of your life trying to chase something that you won't be able to protect in the end. Well, once you file the application, think of that as kind of like the trunk of the tree. It's this thing you've submitted, and eventually you're going to get into the examination phase. That's where you'll get an office action, and in the patent world, it's almost always going to include rejections and objections, which are different things. You'll have to file a response, and your response might follow one path, one branch, and that branch might even have little smaller branches breaking off of it. And that's, let's say, amending the claims, but you might also have arguments that you want to use in response. And you might also have affidavits that you want to submit from experts. There are all these different options, and each option has a different cost associated with it. And in fact, after you submit one response, the patent office might submit additional rejections against you, things they didn't even mention the first time. And you have all your different choices of responding to them. And so as you go down this process, which could even include appeals, there are different costs and different timelines associated with each one. So trying to predict what the overall cost of getting an application to issue, in other words, getting your patent, before you've even done a search, before you've even filed your patent application, it is not just extremely hard. It is frankly impossible. The other closing budget issue that you want to be aware of are allocating percentages of a budget to getting a patent application to go to issue as a patent. So for example, if you're an entrepreneur or a corporation and you have a $30,000 patent budget or a $20,000 patent budget or a $15,000 patent budget, and by the way, this isn't per year, this process is typically over the course of 2 or 3 years, then now we can start getting into percentage allocations. And so for example, I will typically encourage a client with a corporate budget to spend about 20% of that budget on the search phase. And that way you're really putting some effort into discovering what's out there. And that research will give your patent attorney that writes your application a wealth of information so that they can prepare a better application for you, and so you can have a clearer understanding of what it will eventually protect in the market. Then for filing your patent application, preparing it and filing it, budget about 50 to 60% of your budget for that phase. The more time that your patent attorney spends coming up with ways of, we call it layering the onion, with layering options into the invention and its description and its claims, then you will have the maximum flexibility during the prosecution phase and hold your costs down there and give you the ability to cover more stuff. That's an advanced strategy. So then the remainder of whatever is not spent in those two phases would go into the prosecution and allowance phase. So, that's what, 30 to 20%, or I'll write it 20 to 30% for the prosecution phase. It's just an estimate. So I hope this has been helpful. And if you have any further questions, ask below, and look for the other videos about how much it costs to file a utility application, how much it costs to file a provisional patent application, as well as on the different kinds of searches and how much they typically cost.